Hello and welcome to this Medic Mind tutorial. My name's George Hudson and today we're going to be going through section 1 of the BMAT and in particular critical thinking and conclusion theory. Hopefully in today's video I'll be giving you some tips and tricks about how to go about answering these questions and hopefully that will improve the amount of marks you're getting on the BMAT. So without further ado, let's crack on. So the lesson objectives of today are threefold. First, we want to get you thinking about what is a conclusion. Second, we want you to be able to spot triggers. Those are things that allow you to easily find the conclusion in the passage. And third, we want to introduce you to the BMAT cover test, which is ultimately a technique you can use to help improve your timing and accuracy when answering these questions. So before we crack on and find out what is a conclusion, we just have to recap what is a typical argument. In this case, it consists of one or more premise, a link between the premise and the conclusion, and finally, the conclusion itself. That's really what we're looking for in these passages. So just to recap, the premises, which is the evidence, the link between the two, and finally the conclusion, which you can derive from the evidence. So here's a brief example about how to go about spotting a conclusion. You can see on the screen this is an example about global warming. The premise here is that temperatures are rising. The link is that useful word therefore. There's a load of these useful trigger words which can help you to spot the conclusion, and we'll be covering those a bit later on in this tutorial. And finally, you have the conclusion itself, which is that it's clear that global warming is a real threat. So to help you find the conclusion, you can ask yourself a series of 5 major questions. You can ask yourself, first, what is the main focus of the argument? What is the author's main driving point, which is ultimately pinning this whole paragraph together? You can also ask, what is the author trying to convince me of? This is important. The author has written this passage for a reason, and if you can try and find out what that reason is and what they're trying to convince you of, in other words, how persuasive is it, what direction are you being persuaded in, that can help you to find the conclusion. Third, if you think you've found the conclusion, you can ask yourself, if you read that single line, if that one line in the passage, would it summarize the whole thing? Would it summarize the whole passage? And indeed, that's what the conclusion is. It's a line or a phrase which summarizes the whole of the author's opinion. And yes, they may give specific evidence, and yes, there might be contrary opinions within there. But if you can read a line and think that is what the author was meaning when he wrote this passage, and that's what it's all been leading up to, that is quite often the conclusion. Fourth, you can ask yourself, what is the end goal? Like, why has this passage been written? Like I said before, authors tend to write passages because they have an ultimate aim, they have an ultimate goal. And if you can find that goal, then you're often on the right tracks to the conclusion. And finally, usually the tone is quite useful. So for example, if the author was presenting a series of evidence and he was quite optimistic about it, you might take away that the conclusion is that the author agrees with this evidence, that he's quite excited about the direction of progress. Alternatively, if he's quite negative or skeptical, you can take away the conclusion that perhaps more research needs to be done, or perhaps maybe it's not as ideal as it seems. In that way, the tone can give you a good idea about whether the author's going all in and is really excited about what's been said in the passage, or is a bit skeptical and is taking more of a balanced approach. And we'll be going through some of those examples later on. So let's start our first example. You can see the passage on your left and also the question on your right. Pause the video now and have a go. Fantastic! Hopefully you've had a chance to have a go at that question. Let's dive in. So the first thing to note is that this is a conclusion question. And I'm highlighting that in green because it helps us to spot the conclusion, it helps us to frame the way in which we read the passage, and I'll be repeating that a number of times as we go. Now, when we're reading this particular passage, we can see that a lot of the first part of the answer is framing the whole passage. We can see that this is about the moon, and in particular its orbit. It also starts to introduce some solid facts to us about this 5-degree angulation of the moon's orbit relative to the Earth's orbit around the sun. So it's useful to hang on to because that might be a premise for the later conclusion. We then see this crucial linking word here, The truth of the matter is that. In this example, this makes it clear that the conclusion is potentially going to follow. So the author is sort of summarizing what he said before in the exact next sentence. And he says that solar eclipses are a rare phenomenon. He then gives a final little piece of evidence about the Earth's orbit being, the Moon's orbit being elliptical, and that means that actually this is also a rare event. So this is also a second premise, which this time is located after the conclusion. So all in all, that linking word there, which we've highlighted, the truth of the matter is, hopefully that allows you to spot the conclusion, and the conclusion of this paragraph is that solar eclipses are rare, and they should be appreciated as much. So let's go on to the answer options. Answer option A, the Moon's orbit is large enough to block the Sun entirely. Now this seems to be against completely what the passage is saying. The passage is saying that actually this is quite a rare event, and indeed sometimes it's not large enough to block the Sun entirely. And in that sense, this answer option A seems to be heading in the wrong direction. It seems to be on the wrong side of the argument. Answer option B, the Moon's actual orbit is elliptical. Well, yeah, that's true. We can see here that the Moon's actual orbit is elliptical. It literally says that right there in the passage. However, this is more of a passing fact, and indeed when you come across passing facts, that in other words, if you read that fact and it doesn't quite summarize the whole message, or it doesn't quite summarize all of the facts that we're given, that suggests to you that this is a premise and not a conclusion. So actually we can rub that out there. Answer option C, solar eclipses do not happen that often. Well, yeah, this seems to be along the right lines, and indeed we see the truth of the matter is that solar eclipses are a rare phenomenon. And that's exactly what the passage is saying. That closely mirrors answer option C. Answer option D, the Moon's orbit is tilted at more than 5 degrees to the Earth's orbit around the Sun. That seems again to be very similar to answer option B. It's a fact, but not necessarily the conclusion. So that means that we can easily dismiss it, because it doesn't quite capture all of what the author's trying to say, and it doesn't quite capture why he sat down and wrote this passage. Finally, answer option E, the Moon is a perfectly circular orbit. Well, clearly that's not the case. It says at the start that if it were, solar eclipses would be more common. However, it isn't, and we know that from our reading that the Moon's actual orbit is elliptical. So actually, all of those come down to answer option C being the correct answer in this case. So one of the common ways that the BMAT can try and trick you out is by placing the conclusion, like you saw in that last one, potentially in the middle, even at the beginning sometimes, or at the end as it's more commonly found. So actually the take-home message of that last example was the conclusion can be anywhere in the passage, and it's up to you to read the whole passage and really try and dig through it to find the conclusion wherever it might lie. So given that the conclusion is not always at the end, appreciated, it may be at the end often, most of the times, but not always the case. How do you then find the conclusion if it isn't? Well, the conclusion might be the one that is mentioned the most number of times, and that's why it's important to look for keywords. These will be words that are dotted through the passage to help you locate the conclusion. Often the authors sat down to write this passage with a purpose, so they'll keep on circling back to the main conclusion, and that's why keywords can be scattered throughout the passage to help you find that conclusion. Second, the author's conclusion might be the most controversial part of the argument, and that's why it's really important to look for those opinionated clauses, because they can inform you about the tone of the passage and therefore provide a guide as to which way the author is lying on this particular issue. Often, because these passages are opinionated, they sometimes use extreme language, and that can mean that the author has overconfidence in a particular opinion or perhaps underconfidence in a particular issue. Those extremes can help you to find out what the author is thinking when he sat down to write this passage, and therefore you can easily find the conclusion. And third, when we reviewed the typical argument structure, you can see that the conclusion is always connected to a premise by a link. And therefore, by looking for those triggers, those linking words, such as therefore, such as the truth of the matter is, you can help to easily find the conclusion within these passages. So, given that trigger words can be an important way you can find the conclusion, pause the video now and brainstorm as many trigger words as you can think of. And these will be words such as therefore or the truth of the matter is that. Great. Hopefully you've had a chance to review all the trigger words that you can think of, and now let's move on to the list that Medic Minds put together. You can see here on the left you've got words such as consequently, therefore, so, hence, as, thus, before then moving on to the longer phrases such as the most pressing issue or the most important of all. These longer phrases are really obvious, but they're not always there, so it's important to keep an eye out for those shorter phrases, those consequently, those therefore, because they can inform you about where the conclusion is going to come in. Great. Hopefully you've had a chance to have a go at that question on your own. Now let's go through it together. So the first thing I'm going to do in this question is highlight that this is all about conclusions. And that's really key because it frames the way we read the text. Second, you want to look at the first couple of sentences of this passage, and you can see that we're talking about a city and particularly its appearance, its sort of character. And that background information, that contextual information is important because it sets the scene. It might not necessarily be the conclusion, but it just gives us an introduction to what this city is all about. Reading on a bit further, we then come across the phrase most important of all. I'm just going to highlight that there. This is really key because that's a linking word, and actually that tells us that the conclusion is just about to follow. We then read that nobody knows exactly how many people live in Lagos, but they all agree on one thing. Nigeria's biggest city is growing at a terrifying rate. And I think ultimately that is the conclusion. It said most important of all, everybody agrees. These exaggerative phrases give us an idea of what the author's opinion is, and then we see that Nigeria's biggest city is growing at a terrifying rate. And I'm going to circle that because that seems to be the major conclusion here. We then get some evidence that follows. So the UN says 14 million, Lagos' state government says it could be nearer 21 million, etc., etc. We then get some information about 2050 and the future breakdown of the population. So actually, all of that passage that follows that conclusion seems to be just backing up this idea that Nigeria is growing, its population is changing, and that seems to be happening at a terrifying rate. Great, let's move on to the answer options. Answer option A, Lagos' population is growing exponentially. This seems perfect. It seems to dramatically fit with what we just circled in the passage, that Lagos is growing at a terrifying rate. Now, we might be a bit cautious about the word exponentially, but the fact that we got such an exaggerative language such as terrifying rate, everybody agrees, and then we get some facts depicting how large is Lagos and how large is its population, all of that seems to fit with a more exponential picture anyway. So actually we can waive those cautions, and actually answer option A seems to be along the right lines. So let's give that a little tick for now. Answer option B, Lagos is located in Nigeria. Now, clearly this seems to be the case. It's referred to as the biggest city in Nigeria, and actually that seems to be true. However, is it the conclusion? Does it summarize the whole passage? Arguably not. It's simply just a fact. And if we think about what the passage might look like if that was the conclusion, it would look completely different. We'd have information about where Lagos is in Nigeria, how its size has changed over time, where its location has been, where its borders are, etc., etc. So actually answer option B seems to be a conclusion for another passage. In this passage, it's just a passing fact. Answer option C, the population of Lagos is between 14 and 21 million. Again, this seems to be just a premise, it's a passing fact. Moreover, those are only two estimates, and actually the real population of Lagos might be 23 million if another source seems to agree with that. So actually we've only got two sources of information. That's not enough to say that it lies between those values anyway. And even if it did, that would just be a passing fact in this particular case. Answer option D, there is a great deal of poverty in Lagos. Well, yes, you can see that from the dramatic sprawl of poverty mentioned in the first couple of lines. However, that seems to be, again, just sort of setting the scene. It's introductory information, and it doesn't nearly capture what the author's trying to say about Lagos's population. The whole second half of the passage is about population, so purely focusing on the poverty in Lagos is actually missing the bigger picture of what the author was saying. Answer option E, the population in Lagos is very young. Now, that again seems to be true. However, if we look closely, it says by 2050. And indeed, that's in the future, whereas answer option E is in the present. So that kind of rules out answer option E as being anywhere near useful to us. So all in all, answer option A was the correct one. Onto another common trap of the BMAT. A passage might have several conclusions, and it's your job to find the main one. So while you could see in that previous passage those conclusions about the sort of distribution of population, the younger population in the future, those conclusions about the city being in particular poverty, but the real conclusion was all about that population. And you can spot that because it'll be the one that the author spends the most time trying to hammer home, and also it'll be the one that kind of ties together all of those lines of thinking. So in the previous one, the younger population in the future could be based in the idea that today the population is growing so exponentially. So actually that exponential growth of the population was the more appropriate conclusion in that case. Now let's try another answer. This one is question 3 out of 5. You can see the passage on your left and the question on your right. Pause the video now and have a go. Okay, let's go through this together. I'm going to highlight again that this is a conclusion argument. This is a conclusion question. We can see from the first part of the passage that this is about self-esteem, and particularly self-esteem and its relationship with social media. At this point, your mind should be buzzing with things that you've read in your own reading. However, be careful not to let any of that external knowledge influence how you interpret this text. We then seem to introduce the idea of this investigation, particularly with these 63 students. Keep an eye on that. If the author maybe makes a false assumption about the number of students or the sample size, then that can help you, one, locate any flaws in the argument if that was the question, but secondarily sort of spot exaggerated language and therefore allow you to see the conclusion. We then move on, and it seems to just be explaining this whole passage, this whole piece of research. And actually, he seems to be very factually just going through it, offering explanations. We get given an information such as identity shift and the role of social media in creating that identity shift. And particularly, we see that it allows young people to build an ideal image of themselves, which boosts their self-esteem. This is really key because the author starts with self-esteem and he ends with self-esteem. Self-esteem is one of those keywords which is being dropped in throughout the passage and therefore seems to be along the right lines of the conclusion. So let's look at the passage. A, social media can make one happier. Happier is some sort of an emotional construct, and actually that doesn't seem to be what the author's saying. He's talking predominantly about self-esteem, and those two are not equal. So actually answer option A seems to be going a bit too far. It seems to be playing on our own assumptions that self-esteem leads to happiness, but actually the author is keeping it very precise. He's talking about self-esteem. Answer option B, social media can improve one's self-esteem. This seems to be the case. He seems to say that it boosts their self-esteem in a construct known as identity shift, and I've underlined that right there. So we already said that could potentially be the conclusion. So answer option B is looking very good. Answer option C, social media offers every user the chance to have an alter ego. The exaggeration of saying every user, bear that in mind. I mentioned before that this was only in 63 students. So actually this piece of research doesn't extend to every user, every single person who uses social media. And indeed the author is keeping his conclusion quite closely to the research. So actually answer option C goes a bit too precise, it goes a bit too exaggerative in order to fit this passage. Answer option D, social media leads to depression. This comes into what I was saying about not letting your outside knowledge affect your BMAT performance. You might have your own opinions on what social media does, in particular its relationship to mental health issues. However, you really have to put this aside and focus on what the author's saying. He seems to just be describing the research, which suggests that he's passively in agreement. And that seems to say that this statement about social media leading to depression is wrong. Indeed, he doesn't even talk about depression. Answer option E, social media is investigated heavily in psychology. Well, actually, this is only one particular piece of research, so that doesn't seem to fit with this passage at all anyway. So all in all, answer option B seems to be correct. Now it's important to highlight here as well that linking word which we've underlined, therefore. Remember that those linking words usually precede a conclusion and can help you spot it to a greater extent. Okay, another BMAT top tip is to look at these words such as must, could and should. Now must and should are by far the most useful because they highlight very clearly where the author's opinion lies. For example, it must be wrong to eat meat. In that case, you can clearly see that the author is against eating meat and potentially the conclusion is along a similar vein. Likewise, you could say it should be the case that the congestion charge is scrapped. In that case, you can see very clearly the author is against the congestion charge, so any sort of answer options which say that the author is for the congestion charge, you can very easily rule out from the get-go. And finally, the word could, for example, it could be shown to not be trustworthy. This is a sort of less definite case. However, by using the word could, it does suggest that the author is in a sort of passive agreement with the passage. In the previous example, you could see that he was talking predominantly about the research. In that example, if the author was to say it could be seen that social media boosts self-esteem, it suggests that he's tentatively in agreement. And if there's no evidence to the contrary, if he doesn't introduce a must or should later on, then we can conclude that this author is in agreement with the passage. Let's do question 4 out of 5. Have a go at this passage now and the question on your right. Pause the video now. Perfect. Hopefully you've had a go at that. Now let's go through it together. So first things first, I'm going to highlight that this is the main conclusion that we're looking for. We can see on the left that we're talking about Grenfell Tower. And in particular, we can see the evidence suggesting that it happened on the 14th of June and a bit of information about what this particular tower was. Now, from your wider reading, I'm sure you've come across this before, so actually you can very quickly skim read this background information because often, like we saw in the previous examples, the author introduces the topic in the first couple of sentences. So actually, we can largely discount this sort of introductory information and go right to the nitty-gritty where the conclusion might lie. He says that the cladding in the building was thought to be one of the reasons the fire spread enormously quickly. And the use of the word enormously there kind of suggests to us that he is very much almost in agreement that this was a quick fire, this was a devastating event, and actually we should be careful when using this cladding. He then says that the local council opted for a cheaper form which compromised fire safety. So he seems to be putting blame on the local council, and he says that this was ultimately a key player in the spread of the fire. I've circled that because the use of the word key player, it's just that this is really what he thinks. The use of the word, the exaggerative language, the use of key player, all of this pins together to suggest that this author is critical of this cladding and therefore seems to be on the side that fire safety was actually really important and was neglected in this case. He then says the government must reconsider, and I'm going to highlight that word in purple, must. This is what we were just talking about. When authors use the word must, it's clear where their opinion lies. So he says that the government must reconsider its stance on fire safety. He then reaffirms all of what he's been saying by saying it's an unfortunate tragedy that it ultimately was related to things that were dismissed as red tape. So he seems to be ultimately against the idea of this red tape because, against the idea of dismissing this red tape because he seems to say that actually we should be safe, we should be careful. And if we were safe, if we were careful, this wouldn't have happened. So let's go on to the answer options. A, the rigorous fire tests are a common example of red tape. Well, yes, he does say that in the last line, but it's not the conclusion. Indeed, if that was the conclusion, then it would be a very boring passage altogether. And he seems to almost be against this idea of dismissing it as red tape anyway. So actually answer option A is incorrect. Answer option B, the Grenfell Tower fire occurred in North Kensington. This was in the introductory paragraph, remember? And actually that's exactly what it is. It's pure information, it's pure background information. So actually this doesn't say anything about the conclusion of the passage. Answer option C, the government must think again about their policy on fires. Now, this seems to be very close to what we underlined. We can see that the cladding was a key player in the spread of the fire, and then the author says that the government must reconsider its stance on fire safety. That's virtually paraphrasing answer option C, so actually answer option C is looking very good, and we can give it a nice little tick, because that suggests that that's the strongest answer so far. Answer option D, the cladding at Grenfell caused the fire in the building. Well, actually, in this green bit that I've circled, you can hopefully see that he's talking about the spread of the fire. Indeed, you can imagine we don't even know what caused the fire per se. It could have been some electrical device. It could have been any other number of things. This passage is purely talking about the spread of the fire. So actually, that rules out answer option D. And finally, answer option E, the government is more concerned with costs than safety. Well, arguably, that's not the case. It might be that the government didn't quite know about the costs or the safety that was being involved. It just sort of signed off this cladding without really appreciating it. So actually the author is saying that we must reconsider the policy of just signing off potentially rather than necessarily the priorities of government. So actually this statement, answer E, goes a bit too far, which leaves us with answer option C as the most correct and the best conclusion of this passage. Hopefully you got that. If not, don't worry, we've got one more example left after this. So our final tip for today, and this is a timing tip, is the BMAT cover test. Now the BMAT cover test is where you sort of cover up the answer options, you read the passage, and you make up your own mind about what the conclusion is before moving on to the answer options. Because the BMAT is such an opinionated piece of writing, and because the BMAT is really digging into your ability to think for yourself, this is really important, because if you just read through the answer options as soon as you've read through the passage, you might easily be swayed in a particular direction, and that might be the wrong direction. So make up your mind first, then reveal the answer options and see whether one closely links up to what you were thinking. If it does, that suggests that you're along the right lines. Now this is our final answer of today. Have a go at this now by pausing the video and we'll go through it together in a second. Okay, fantastic. Let's go through it together. So again, I'm going to highlight this is the main conclusion that we're looking for. It does give us a bit of extra information about Stephen Hawking, but largely that's irrelevant at this stage. The author introduces speaking as a scientist, cherry-picking evidence is unacceptable. The fact that they're talking about cherry-picking evidence being unacceptable in a very exaggerative word, and the fact that the author introduces their role almost as evidence for that being a legitimate statement, suggests this is going to be a very opinionated piece of writing. And that's useful. Let's look out for those opinionated words as we read. We see that he goes on to talk about evidence, he goes on to talk about the public trust in the scientific profession, but then there's a subtle shift, and that's potentially around here when he starts talking about private agency staff. Now, after this point, he's largely talking about the NHS and the broader system as a whole, the broader NHS. And in particular, the use of the word private, we can see that it sort of crops up again down here at the bottom. We see that private versus publicly run systems. It seems that Stephen Hawking is talking about private versus public running of the NHS. And by sprinkling in those keywords throughout the argument, that seems to reaffirm that the conclusion will be something to do with this sort of broader picture of private versus public, and particularly the idea that money is being extracted from the system as profit. So it seems altogether, by use of the word extracted, by use of the recurrent public versus private debate, we can see that Stephen Hawking is viewing this very negatively, and he doesn't want this private system. He says we're going towards a US-style insurance system, and I'll just highlight there. He says we're going towards this sort of system, and that is actually a negative thing to do, because actually we must prevent the establishment of a two-tier service and ultimately ensure we have this most efficient publicly run service. So let's look at the answer options. Answer option A, we should follow the US-style insurance system run by private companies. Clearly that's incorrect. Stephen Hawking is against this idea. He's saying that we are heading towards that direction, but he very much disagrees with it. He thinks we must prevent the establishment of this private system. Answer option B, there is far too much investment in the NHS. Well, that would be a very controversial opinion. Indeed, in your wider reading, you should know that a lot of people think that we should invest more in the NHS. So if Stephen Hawking was really saying this counter-opinion, it would be very controversial. So we should be a bit cautious about this one. And indeed, he doesn't really talk about investment at all. All he says is that private agencies are extracting that money from the service. So if anything, he's saying we need more investment, we need more funds to avoid this extraction damaging the NHS. So actually, that rules out answer option B. Answer option C, the government is not focused on making profit from the NHS. Well, clearly that could be the case from the outside reading, you know that is the case. However, he's not directly talking about what the government's aims are here. He's simply stating what is the current state of play and what's his opinion of it. So actually, answer option C is incorrect. Answer option D, there is far too much controversy over the NHS. Again, that doesn't seem to be along the right lines. Stephen Hawking is raising an issue and saying his opinion. He's not talking about the broader controversy surrounding the NHS, and he's not making a judgment whether there is too much or too little. Finally, answer option E, the public should be worried about the future of the NHS. Now, this does seem to be along the right lines. He says we're heading towards a US insurance-style system, and we must prevent this. The only caution you should have in your mind is whether he's talking to the broader public. Now, if we think about that, we can see that he's saying speaking as a scientist. Now, we know this is Stephen Hawking. If he was talking to fellow scientists, then he wouldn't necessarily introduce himself as a scientist. In that way, we suggest that he's talking to a broader audience. In other words, he's talking to the public. He's written this to the public. So all in all, he seems to say that we're heading towards an insurance-style system. We shouldn't be doing that. And he's talking to the public. That all fits together with answer option E. So let's give that a little tick. And indeed, that is the correct answer. Hopefully you can see on the left, there's also that underlined must. It's important to spot that because, like we said, this is a very opinionated piece. It's not the only piece of opinion in this whole passage, but it does highlight where the conclusion might lie because it starts to make kind of broad, sweeping statements. So actually, it's important to recognize that word must, and you can see the conclusion here is that the most efficient way is to run a public system, and we're not doing that at the current minute, or we're heading towards a situation where that won't be the case. So what's our step-by-step series of questions to help us identify the conclusion? Hopefully you've seen asking yourself what is the most important thing to take away from this paragraph can be a very important question to help you identify the conclusion. Likewise, you can then ask yourself which line of the paragraph best displays the author's opinion. Remember, these are opinionated passages, and by spotting the opinion, you can often try and work out the conclusion. Finally, if you're still struggling, you can ask yourself what summarizes everything in the passage, what summarizes everything in the paragraph. In that sense, you can sort of capture every one of the author's opinions in a single conclusion. And that's ultimately what we're testing here. Thank you for watching today's video. Hopefully you've learned something, and these are the key take-home points. First, we wanted you to learn what is a conclusion. Hopefully from the examples we've gone through, you can see a conclusion lies anywhere in the passage, but importantly, summarizes all of the premises. Second, we wanted you to be able to spot trigger words. Now they can be things such as therefore, consequently, the truth of the matter, but we also talked about those trigger words for the author's opinion, such as must, should, and could. Finally, we introduce you to the CT cover test. That's the critical thinking cover test, which allows you to cover up the answer options, make up your own mind before then going on to answer the question. And that's key to avoid you being swayed in any particular wrong direction by the answer options. You want to think for yourself, and you want to be able to make up your own mind and match those up with the answers afterwards. Great, so that's our lesson complete. Hopefully that was useful. My name's George, and I'll look forward to seeing you again sometime soon. Thank you.